On Thursday the 4th of July, just earlier this month, a 31-year-old dancer named Deundray Cottrell was supposed to be out celebrating Independence Day with his family, when he would mysteriously disappear. Later that night, his boyfriend Julian Morris would approach his sister to announce that he saw Deundray jumping off the upstairs balcony before running away down the street. So concerned by this irrational behaviour, his family immediately went out looking for him in the pitch-black darkness, hoping it wouldn't be too long before they found him. But despite searching throughout the entire night, they were still unable to locate Deundray, and so they were unfortunately given no choice but to report him missing to the local police. They then spent the next day handing out posters and speaking to the media. However, in a cruel twist of fate, the police were eventually alerted to a piece of Deundray's clothing, and after checking the surrounding area, they would discover his lifeless body in a shed less than a mile away from the house he disappeared from. In the weeks since his discovery, however, the police have still not been able to confirm a cause of death, with Deundray's boyfriend being the primary suspect, but to this day, the case remains unsolved, understandably leaving his family disturbed as they are only left to wonder what really happened to Deundray Cottrell, and more importantly, who could be responsible. Deundray Dominique Cottrell, who was affectionately nicknamed Bubba by his family, was born on the 18th of October in 1992 to his loving parents in the city of Birmingham, Alabama, alongside his sister Angelica. Little is known about his younger years, but what we do know is that he attended Woodlawn High School and would go on to graduate with the goal of making his dream of becoming a professional dancer a reality. And in typical Deundray fashion, this was something that he would of course eventually achieve, after meeting a man named Dearic Williams, who he would eventually fall in love with, after the pair started a dance group together. The two were inseparable for years, with Dearic's crazy, energetic spirit being complemented by Deundray's more relaxed and suave demeanour, so it was no surprise that their strong relationship would effortlessly translate over to their chemistry on stage, as the pair quickly became an unstoppable force in the Atlanta dance scene. But as well as his success within the creative arts, Deundray was also very intellectually gifted, so despite his incredibly busy schedule, he somehow managed to find time to study for a PhD alongside his dancing business, which also coincided with a few brief steps into content creation as well. So I think it would be safe to say that Deundray was an extremely determined and hard-working individual, who was no doubt loved and envied by his friends and family. However, although he was certainly excelling in his career, there were some question marks around his romantic relationship that started to emerge towards his late 20s, when a new man named Julian Morris would enter his dance group, turning the already established duo into a trio known as the Ski Boys, and together they would not only perform on stage as a group, but would also enter somewhat of a polygamous relationship. However, although at first Deundray seemed happy with this change, he never could have predicted what would eventually occur on that fateful day in July. On Thursday the 4th of July, the 31-year-old man had been invited to his sister's house to celebrate Independence Day as a family, so without hesitation he quickly accepted and agreed to drive over from Atlanta to Birmingham for a short vacation. However, upon arrival, his sister Angelica was surprised to see that he had not travelled alone, as Deundray had decided to bring along his new boyfriend and fellow dancer Julian Morris, which was strange as he would usually bring his other long-term partner Dearic Williams to these kinds of events. But not wanting to make the situation awkward, Angelica simply invited the pair into her home and together they began to prepare for the party. So, as day soon turned to night, more guests would continue to arrive at the residence, and the house began to fill up in time for the 9 PM fireworks display that they had planned. However, soon after the first few fireworks had gone off, barking could be heard from inside the house, as Angelica's dog was reacting to the loud, unfamiliar sounds. So, given his kind and caring nature, Deundray immediately volunteered to check on the dog. But little did Angelica know that as she watched him walk into the house, this would be the final time she would ever see her brother alive, as just a few hours later, Julian Morris would interrupt her with some terrifying news. On Friday the 5th of July, In the early hours of the morning, Julian Morris would suddenly approach Angelica Harris to inform her that he had just witnessed Deundray leaping from her balcony before he would run off into the darkness. According to Julian, he didn't know why exactly, but he was very concerned given how strange his partner had been behaving that night. So, worried that Deundray may have been struggling with some issues at the time, the family immediately went out onto the streets to look for the troubled man. But strangely, Julian decided to stay back, with Angelica later suggesting that he was more interested in having something to eat. However, after spending hours searching in the darkness, Angelica and the rest of the family eventually gave up and decided to head back home to report the incident, and after interacting with Julian once again, he was then forced to leave the premises as he was coming across as extremely unhelpful, and Angelica was sick of his nonchalant attitude to the situation. So, with the growing concern around his disappearance, the family felt that they had no other choice but to officially report Deundray Cottrell as missing to the local police, with hopes that it wouldn't be too long before he was found. But in a heartbreaking twist of fate, this is exactly what would soon happen. On Saturday the 6th of July, officers from the Birmingham Police Department were sent out to the Harris residence to see if they could uncover any potential leads as to what could have happened to Deundray. The day before, Angelica had called them with fears that her brother could have been in danger, given his apparent strange behaviour during their Independence Day celebrations. But after arriving on the scene, the police were immediately concerned to find out that Deundray's cell phone and some of his clothing had already been recovered from the backyard, meaning wherever he was, it would be difficult to track him down. So with this discovery, what had initially seemed to be a simple missing person case would suddenly evolve into something much more dangerous, and so the police then decided to check all local surveillance cameras to see if they could get a better understanding of which direction he could have gone in that night. But despite their initial struggles to track down the footage, they would eventually uncover a videotape which showed a severely disturbed man who appeared to be running for his life on the night of July 4th, which would later be identified as Deundray Cottrell. According to the police, he was captured on multiple cameras jumping over fences and running through random backyards, in what looked like an attempt to seek refuge from somebody who may have been chasing him. But unfortunately, the footage would eventually end with Deundray running away from the view of the camera and disappearing into the night once again. So, based on this worrying footage, it was then agreed that the police would begin a perimeter search to see if they could find any more clues. But it would be fair to say that they were not too confident given the fact that Angelica and the rest of the family had spent the entire previous day looking for the missing young man with no luck. However, determined to get to the bottom of this mystery, officers began conducting a much more thorough search, which consisted of knocking on every single door in the local neighbourhood, and even searching abandoned buildings and garden sheds in a mission to leave no stone unturned. But despite some claims that the police were potentially wasting their time, these efforts would eventually prove to be invaluable, as later that very afternoon, an officer would uncover a scene that would break the hearts of an entire community. On Sunday the 7th of July, the Birmingham Police Department would hold a press conference in which they would reveal that the body of Deundray Cottrell had been unfortunately found deceased in a shed just 1 block away from his sister's home. According to the officers, his body was in the beginning stages of decomposition, meaning that he had likely been killed the very same night he had disappeared. However, they did mention that an autopsy was still due to be conducted, and therefore all further information would be restricted until more evidence was brought forward. But just before closing up, one last piece of information that they did expose was that Julian Morris was now a person of interest, and therefore they were looking to bring him in for questioning. So, given his association with the case, police then firmly set their sights on tracking down Deundray's new boyfriend, with the aim of trying to understand what could have happened that night. And as Julian was the last person to officially see Deundray alive, he was understandably suspect number 1. However, despite his face since being shared with the nation, Julian is still nowhere to be found, and to this day he remains a wanted person, with the police begging the public for help in their search for the truth. Now, unfortunately, as far as the official investigation goes, this is all we know for now. But in the meantime, Deundray's family are continuing to search for answers in his case, as they know it will only be a matter of time before the responsible suspect is brought to justice. However, given that the key witness Julian Morris remains missing almost a month later, with only his lawyer coming forward to say anything on the situation, we need to do everything we can to try and locate him as quickly as possible, as until he is found and brought in for questioning, that night will forever remain a blur. So with that, let's get into some of the potential theories. Now, usually at this point in the video, I will attempt to run through as many viable options as possible which may help explain what happened, but I think you will agree that in the case of Deundray Cottrell, there is only one theory in particular which clearly stands above the rest, and that is, of course, that Julian Morris was responsible for his death, as he has been on the run ever since the night of his disappearance. He was also acting very strange when speaking to Angelica and seemed to come across as unfazed by the entire situation, almost as if he knew something that others didn't. Now, this alone doesn't make him guilty, but it certainly paints him in a controversial light, and when you attach this piece of information alongside the fact that Deundray was still very much in love with his long-term partner De'Eric Williams, you can certainly start to see a potential motive. However, until he is brought to justice, I feel we have to at least briefly consider some other options, like maybe Julian gave Deundray some bad drugs and therefore feels responsible for what happened but didn't necessarily pull the trigger. But in my opinion, this idea would be a massive stretch, as the much more likely theory would have to be that he murdered Deundray that night for an unexplained reason. So this is why I believe it is so important that Julian is brought in for questioning, as until this happens, I fear that Deundray's friends and family will never find out the whole truth. However, taking a slight step back from the case, there is another story which I covered on this channel a few months ago, which covers the disappearance of another man who was involved in a love triangle. But unlike the case of Deundray Cottrell, he was never found, and remains a missing person to this day. On Tuesday the 24th of October, just last year in 2023, a 39-year-old man named Destin Henderson was supposed to be spending the day at his apartment in Houston when he would mysteriously disappear. According to his mother Lawana, she had last spoken to him earlier that day when he mentioned that he was busy with a friend and said he would call her back once his guest had left. However, after an entire day had passed with Destin failing to call her back, Lawana started to worry that her son may have been in trouble, as this was very unusual behaviour. So, rightfully concerned, she began frantically calling his phone, hoping that he would eventually pick up. But to her surprise, he would continue to ignore her calls, and it would be Destin's friend that would suspiciously decide to call Lawana directly, as he too was alarmed by Destin's strange and sudden disappearance. So alarmed, in fact, that he had already decided to report him as missing to the Harris County Sheriff's Office. But it would later be revealed that this friend was actually Destin's ex-partner Alex Rydell, who despite their breakup had been continuing to see each other even while Alex was supposed to be in a new romantic relationship with a woman. However, despite the concerning details that surround this case, after 9 months of searching, the police have only been able to locate Destin's car, with the 39-year-old continuing to remain a missing person to this day. So, if there's anything to learn from this story, it's that love triangles can be dangerous and potentially even fatal, as both victims were involved in these kinds of relationships just before disappearing. And therefore, we can only hope that, unlike in the case of Destin Henderson, the suspect in Deundray's case will eventually be identified, providing some much-needed closure to those who knew and loved him. Anyway, on that note, I think I'll leave this video here. But until next time, thank you so much for watching, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for updates on these stories. And if you would like to hear more about the case of Destin Henderson, feel free to check out the video on screen now.